Hello there! My name is Brent, and today we are taking a hike deep into Death Valley to a forgotten mine to follow in the footsteps of one of the strangest characters I have ever read about. Just beautiful. This is a man who took out mining claims, sold them a month later for millions, got the claims back, lost the claims in a game of roulette, and eventually murdered a man over the same claims. It is one of the craziest and strangest stories I have ever read about. And because of the remote nature, a lot of the mine is still there. Imagine hauling all this stuff out here. That's so cool. So let's go check it out. So right now we're in Death Valley in the Funeral Mountain Range. And this is a range that was made famous by a mine called the Keene Wonder Mine. And the Keene Mine was a huge gold boom town around the turn of the century, around 1900. Ironically, the guy who started the Keene Wonder Mine, Keene, was eventually involved with a lot of shootings and went to jail for murder in Ireland, much like the guy that founded the Big Bell Mine. And that is the mine that we are headed to. And the Big Bell Mine was put together by a guy named Johnny City and Mike Sullivan. And Johnny was also known as Johnny Behind the Gat because he had a desire to pull out his weapon at every moment. And we'll talk more about that, about how that led to his demise eventually. But this area is just beautiful. I find that the desert just holds some of the most interesting characters you can imagine. And I love following in their footsteps and just sometimes wondering why they did what they did. So back in 1907 is when Johnny City and Mike Sullivan climbed down here and they were like, you know what? We're gonna mine this. Johnny, the Johnny Behind the Gat, had previously been up in the Bodie area, which is connected to Cerro Gordo quite a bit. Johnny and Mike took out 10 claims in these mountains. And only a month later, because of the kind of hype and almost hysteria that this area had going on, they were able to convince a guy to buy those 10 claims for $250,000, which is like $8 million in today's money. And that guy wired over a $25,000 deposit. And a year later, that guy couldn't make the mine work. And so he didn't go through the option to fully purchase the mine, and City and Sullivan got the mine back. Eventually, they leased it again to this guy named O'Brien. And starting around 1905, O'Brien started hauling all sorts of things up into this mountain range. And a year later, they were actually mining. And there were newspaper articles about all of the ore that was going to Rhyolite. And when it came time for O'Brien to renew his lease, City took the mine back over and had some financing with some other people. They called it the Death Valley Big Bell Mining Company, and they started hyping it as the next big thing. And City again wasn't much of a miner, he was mainly a prospector, so he took his money, went to Rhyolite, started a little thing called the Unique Dance Hall, where some of the miners out here could dance with his girls. And unfortunately that business didn't work out too well for old Johnny, and combined with his love of gambling, he was broke by the end of 1907. So much so that he couldn't even pay $6.86 in property taxes. But then what happened after he was broke is something right out of a Western movie, and something that we'll talk about once we can actually see this mine. So here we are at the Big Bell mine, 115 years later. Still a lot of stuff here. You have to think about when there's a lot of stuff left at mines, it's typically the most remote and difficult to get to mines. Unfortunately, otherwise, a lot of people come and scavenge and take what they can, but I see some beds in there where miners would have stayed. Look at this, they built it into the side of the cliff here as the back wall, then built out with just the natural rocks. They didn't have to bring these anywhere. Imagine hauling all this stuff out here. See, they got their stove out here, fridge, beds, wood, cardboard, anything they could do for insulation, I imagine. What I often wonder about is like, what is the equivalent of this today? You know, this was an extractive industry that came in to get something and get out, and they left behind kind of a mess. And I wonder what is our equivalent of that today in today's day and age. I think we'll have to hike over there to get a feel of the real mine and see what brought old Johnny and Mike out here. It's so quiet. This is what they brought all this stuff out here for. This quartz. This is a gold mine out of Silver Lake, Cerro Gordo, so you can see they're doing some processing here back in the day. The links that men will go for gold. There's a good sample there. Built up a little tailing pile there. It's kind of right in the wash. Yeah, there you go. There's one of their veins they were trying to follow. They stoped right through that. Well, this is interesting. Like I've seen in many other circumstances, like the beekeeper and other miners in remote areas. They were living in the mine. There's some beds, frames, some old kind of duck canvas type clothing. Some of the miners were living in the bunkhouse. Some got the mine shaft. But they went up over here, so that's nice. At least they have some light. But here we have tobacco. February 26, 1926, 7/8. W.T. Blackwell & Co. Tobacco, Durham, North Carolina. That's so cool. And yeah, still a lot of track. You have some of the jacks and drills. Those would have gone up against a face of the mine to drill and then blast. There's your drill, and then your rod, your steel would have gone in here. That's awesome. Again, because this is so remote, a lot of stuff is still here. It's also the national park, so everything stays where it is, please. It's interesting to me is that this mine doesn't go very far back, but the idea that they had track built and an aerial tramway makes me believe that they thought that this was going to be a much bigger mine than it was, or possibly it was all for show. Sometimes mine owners would go through this whole rigmarole to basically try to entice investors. So the investors would come out and they say, look, we have track, we have an aerial tramway. This is going to be the next Keen Wonder. This is going to be the next Bodie. The level of infrastructure doesn't match the ore deposit as far as I can tell. Either very bullish or playing the investors or both. So the ore carts would have come out here, dumped their ore down in this. Big rocks would have stayed behind, shoot down into the tramway, over to the ball mill. One of the more well-preserved mines I've seen. All right, let's get over and actually see the mill itself. Gold refining over the years has taken a lot of forms. Gold likes to hide in rock. So to free it, people have tried a lot of different things. First was muscles and gravity. Crush up the rock, wash it so the light stuff floats off, and the heavy gold stays behind. That's what you're seeing when you look at old time photos of people panning for gold. But with that process, tiny gold slips through. So the old timers figured out that they could use mercury. Mercury clings to gold like glue. And if you get enough, then you burn off the mercury and you get a glob of gold. But you also poison a lot of people in rivers. So the next big breakthrough was in the 1890s with cyanide. In a weak solution, cyanide dissolves gold like sugar in water. And the big steel tanks here are where that chemistry happened. So in this tank, if you look to the far side, you see some metal balls, almost like cannonballs. And those balls would have been what was used to crush up the quartz from the mine over there inside of this mill here. So those would have banged around with the quartz, creating a fine powder that then would have gone into these leaching tanks. So they would have put the fine substance in here, they would have put some cyanide on it, then the gold would be pulled back out with carbon or zinc. And this method isn't perfect either. It can also poison people in rivers, but it does a good job of getting all the gold, even the gold you can't see, out of the rock. And that's why it's used even 100 years later in many modern gold mines. But it's interesting, they spent so much time thinking about the effort to get from there to there. Imagine the effort to get from here out of here to anywhere you could process this ore. And that, I believe, so these are for. Look at these wagons. From my understanding, there's an extremely steep road. You can see the cut of it up there. And they reimagined this Mack into something that they could winch all the way up the canyon. And so they bolted anchor points at different areas, and then they would winch this thing up. Look at that, some wooden wheels on that wagon. Very cool. Plus, we gotta discuss Johnny and his exploits and failures after they lost all his money. Oop, not going this way. Johnny was a gambling man, and in one legendary 12-hour roulette game, he bet and lost 250,000 shares to this mine. The newspapers reported that just a few months prior, these shares were worth 30 cents a piece, so $75,000. He literally bet against the house and he lost everything. And there was very little sympathy for Johnny's, and a lot of local miners were excited that with him out of the way, finally a real mining company could come in. And eventually sold around 1911 for about $2,600 in back taxes. But old Johnny was back in the area mining the Big Bell extension mine. Unfortunately for Johnny, he maybe didn't do the right paperwork to actually be mining those claims. And so another guy named Smith had also taken out paperwork for these same claims. And this all came to a head one day when Smith came to the claims. City was mining them. Arguments happened, guns were drawn, and City shot and killed Smith a very short distance from here. This immediately enraged the locals. Smith was a very well-respected prospector. City was this gambler, this drunk, this guy that was just losing his mind always. And it went to trial. And during the trial, City was convicted of manslaughter, much to the disappointment of many locals that wanted him charged with murder, and he got sentenced to 1 to 10 years in prison. Somehow, City was able to get a retrial, and in the retrial, City was acquitted because of self-defense. Apparently, Smith had pulled his gun first, so City was just acting in self-defense. The locals were, of course, upset, and City kind of went away for a little bit. But like any obsessed miner, he came back around 1911 and started mining the exact same claim where he had shot and killed Smith. He found some very promising ore. He purchased a stamp mill at auction for about $500. He built a cabin and he lived at this stamp mill and cabin for a number of years. The story of City shooting people does not end here. He continues doing that. So we're going to look around here a little bit more, fully get the idea of this Big Bell mine. Then we're going to go try to see where City had his stamp mill and put our shoes in the mind of this obsessed miner who seemed to have a habit of shooting and killing people. This mine kind of had a rocky life. After City lost it, then the guy from the Keen Wonder mine lost it, then it kind of just sat in a state of abandonment for a while, and then around 1936, Cohen and Company kind of gave it a final go. So a lot of this stuff at the latest would have been from the 1930s, and they couldn't make much of it. And there was always rumors of this becoming a mine once again. You know, that people love to think, what if we were just an inch away from the big deposit? But in the 1990s, this became a national park, and there has been no mining in the national park since about 2005. Again, a reminder of what's left behind when the boom ends. I am just so tempted, to be honest, to go down to this wash and walk it for a long ways. I always say that if you're looking for anything, walk the wash, because over the years of all of this stuff, it would have been pulled down for 100 years and pushed down that wash. So this is to you tip, one of my old mentors that used to always tell me to walk the wash. Let's go see what we can find down there. Here's that ore cart that we saw from the top. We were talking just a minute ago about the ball mill. This would have been what is used to grind up the quartz right over there. As you can imagine, these clanking around would have done some serious damage to the quartz. And there's different sizes, as you can see. They must be everywhere because they're going through a lot of them. And as we proceed, we can see, I bet these were placed where they were for access to water when it did happen in a flood. They could dam this and get some water. You can see the cable going down the wash and that cable system, and that is connected to an old Mack. And from my understanding, they added a winching engine to this converted Mack truck bed, and they would put ties into the rock. They would slowly winch this thing up the canyon to get their supplies in. So they have to do that over and over again, just up insane terrain. That is really cool. These wheels, imagine this thing has just been beat up by the rains in the last 100 years. You can kind of tell how fast these things start flowing from time to time. Man, I'm glad that I walked the wash. All right, I'm spinning it around. The sun is closing in quick, and it's summer in Death Valley, so to be very aware of how long you're spending outside. And City, when he bought this mill, he dragged it like to the middle of nowhere, and so I'm pretty sure I know how to get there, and that is in part because of Onyx Off-Road. And Onyx Off-Road is a mapping app that I've just found invaluable in these backcountry explorations. It allows you to see where public land is, private land, trails that nothing else can see. You know, when I wanted to find a route to the trailhead for the Big Bell, Google Maps had no idea, Apple Maps had no idea. Onyx directed me exactly to the trailhead. And there's reviews from other people if it's a well-known trail. It shows cell service, so you know whether you're gonna have coverage. So I've just found it to be amazing. And if you wanna try it out, Onyx Off-Road is giving 20% off your first year membership. All you have to do is put in Brent at the checkout or click the link in my description. And again, this thing has been a game changer for me the last 6 months or so. And with that, we're gonna keep trekking to the mill site of our infamous Johnny City and talk about his next shooting that he got into. This is the water that both Keen Wonder and City needed for their operation. Mining is very water intensive, especially when you're in gold mining, and so this field is what we're looking for. The water's clear. Fortunately, I think even 100 years later, it's contaminated because of the gold mining that City and others are doing here, but it sure looks nice. And up here, up this slightly damp ridge is where old Johnny behind the Gat City made those boys way back then haul his mill that he bought for $500. That cabin is where Johnny would have spent a lot of time overlooking a lot of desert. So this is the 3-stamp mill that Johnny picked up for about $500 at an auction. You can see underneath 3 chutes for the 3 stamps. After the ore was crushed, it would have come down here for processing. And there's a lot about this stamp mill getting here. There's not a lot about the production. I don't think in the end, Johnny either had the patience or the mine wasn't quite as good as he thought. And eventually, he spent most of his time caretaking the Keene Wonder Mine, which is about a mile south of here. And he lived there for about on and off 10 or 20 years. And once again, he found himself in trouble around 1926 with a guy named George Dalton. And at that time, he was trying to get a hotel going, and Dalton was a competing hotel guy, and he shot his neighbor, Mr. Dalton, and was convicted with assault with a deadly weapon. But as Johnny does, he was able to appeal and once again able to get off charges, living out his life in Rhyolite. So the length of time he used this probably wasn't terribly long, but I feel like the only thing left to do is to sit in this cabin, try to imagine what old Johnny was thinking. It's very still in this cabin, but there's definitely still like a feeling. This guy, Johnny City, was so stubborn. You know, he found the mine, he leased the mine, he lost the mine, he later murdered a guy over a claim, and then he still came back again and dragged this stamp mill into the middle of nowhere and built this hut and hung out. I think that type of determination, that type of stubbornness is what built the West. It's what created places like this, but it also cost a lot of people everything. You know, it makes me think, like, what am I chasing and what is it costing me? You know, in Johnny's case, it was literal gold that he was going after, but these days it could be status, money, relationships, fame, power, whatever it is. Those are the kind of questions that this type of history leads me to thinking. But I will leave you with those for now. And as always, thank you all so much for watching these videos. You know, your support means everything. And until next time, I hope you guys have a great week.